Pocahontas chapter 4. This is part 2 of chapter 4, beginning on page 64. We are continuing the story of Pocahontas, where Mr. Whittaker is trying to convert her to Christianity. We're going to start reading with the paragraph that begins with, "His name was John Rolfe, a handsome 28-year-old widower. He was a survivor of the Bermuda shipwreck, and since joining the colony, he had become best known for his interest in tobacco. Ever since tobacco had been brought to England from the West Indies in the late 1500s, smoking had become the fashion. King James hated it. He said smoking was ugly to look at, nasty to smell, bad for the brain, and awful for the lungs. But in spite of the king, young men all over England were pulling on pipes, puffing, and blowing smoke rings. John Rolfe, a chain smoker, was determined not only to raise tobacco in Virginia, but to raise enough of it so he could sell it to England. In 1613 he was experimenting with a high grade of West Indian tobacco which he had planted at or near Henrico. John Rolfe and Pocahontas probably first met at church, but it was not long before he began dropping in at the parsonage, offering to help Pocahontas with English lessons, reading to her from the Bible. John was lonely, his wife having died soon after arriving in Jamestown, his baby daughter having died in Bermuda. But he was a serious-minded, proper, religious man whose best friend was Sir Thomas Dale, and like him, he believed in living by rules. So he was somewhat surprised when he found himself becoming interested not only in Pocahontas's religion, but in Pocahontas herself. Perhaps he was falling in love, although Christian men were not supposed to fall in love with heathen women. It was even written in the Bible that God did not like men to take strange wives, women with different religions and different customs. John Rolfe carried on long arguments with himself, for he had to admit that Pocahontas was strange. Her education, as he wrote, had been rude, her manners barbarous, her generation accursed. So what was he to do? Pocahontas, who of course was also lonely, knew exactly what to do. She studied hard. She learned to say the Lord's Prayer and to recite the Apostles' Creed. When Reverend Whittaker asked her the questions of the catechism, she was able to give the right answer to every one, whether she knew what it meant or not. In the spring of 1614, she said she was ready to become a Christian. At her baptism, she was required to renounce Oki, to declare that all her former beliefs were false and evil. Hard as it may have been, she said what she was supposed to. Perhaps she was truly convinced. Perhaps with her new name, Rebecca, which the settlers gave her at her conversion, she willed herself away from her old world into her new one, at least as much as she could. For how could she completely part with the Indian in her? How could she ever take the sun for granted in the careless way that the English did? By this time, John Rolfe had stopped arguing with himself. Indeed, he decided it was God's will that he should marry Pocahontas. He had already found out that it was Pocahontas's will, too. In England, people would surely be glad for the marriage, he reasoned. They had always preached conversion, and here was Powhatan's own daughter, a princess, not only converted, but becoming English by marriage. John Rolfe listed all the reasons in favor of the marriage and wrote Sir Thomas Dale for permission to go ahead. Dale thought the marriage was a splendid idea, but he didn't know how Powhatan would take it. First, he thought he'd make one last try to get those guns. as usual, Dale's method was to fight for what he wanted. So, in March 1614, he took Pocahontas and 150 men upriver, informing whatever natives he saw that the English wanted their guns back. If they didn't get them, they would burn down the native villages, take their canoes, destroy their fishing nets. When the Indians responded by shooting arrows at the English, Dale did just what he said he would do. And what did Pocahontas think of this? Probably she had seen enough war in her life to accept that this was how men behaved, Indians and English alike. But by now she was convinced that no matter what Dale did, Powhatan was not going to part with those guns. Not for her sake or for the sake of peace. Later, two of Pocahontas' brothers came on the ship to see how she was. They could see that she had been treated well, even though she looked strange in her English clothes. But she was certainly in a bad temper. She told them that as far as she was concerned, her father could keep his old guns. She had waited and waited. Almost a year she had waited to come home, but now she wasn't coming home at all. She was going to stay with the English and marry an Englishman. Let them tell her father that. The English were back in Jamestown when Powhatan heard the news. It was not only his pride that had been at stake, but his very kingship. Those guns, many of them won in war, taken from the dead, had become a symbol of power between him and the English, even among his own people. Surrender would be total surrender, and he would never agree to that. But now all that had changed. If Pocahontas was no longer a hostage, he had no need to surrender. He could offer. He could make the first move. Quickly he sent messengers to Dale. He was ready for peace, he said. If Pocahontas was to marry an Englishman, this was a sign of true friendship. He would even return some weapons. He would not attend the wedding, since he had vowed never to step into an English settlement, but he would appoint one of his brothers to take his place. He sent Pocahontas a string of freshwater pearls as a wedding present, and several pieces of land. On April 5th, 1614, the wedding took place in the Jamestown church, with many of the settlers and some of Pocahontas' own family attending. Pocahontas wore a long dress made of the richest-looking material that could be found in Jamestown. With it she wore a muslin tunic, a white veil, and the string of pearls her father gave her. Reverend Buck, who had christened John Rolfe's baby girl in Bermuda and later buried her, performed the ceremony, and at the end of the service, Pocahontas was not only officially married, she was officially English. It would have been strange if it did not occur to her that now she was a countryman of John Smith's, even if he was dead. The settlers called the peace that followed the Peace of Pocahontas. Sir Thomas Dale was so impressed at the way one marriage had turned the Indians into friends, he didn't see why another marriage wouldn't make them even better friends. Powhatan had another daughter whom he called his favorite. Why shouldn't Sir Thomas Dale himself marry her? It didn't seem to trouble him that he already had a wife in England. No, he went right ahead and sent Ralph Hammer, an officer of the colony, to see Powhatan and make arrangements. I'm going to stop here now. This is the end of part 2 for chapter 4. We have just a little bit more to read in part 3. So take another little break and we'll be right back.